Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. Milu, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I'm happy to be here. I think we're going to have a fun conversation with somebody who's doing some similar stuff to us. So I think it's cool to have like-minded peers that we can talk to about podcasting and talking about security topics. So I'm looking forward to talking to our guest. You want to introduce him?
Yeah. It's going to get a little meta. I'm sure we'll talk podcasting inside baseball a little bit, but I've always enjoyed behind the curtain type conversations and podcasts I listen to. So yeah, this week we're going to have AJ Nash on. I got to know him at a conference recently that I was at, where he was speaking on a panel session. It was unfortunate that I didn't actually get a chance to talk to him in person there, but as I was kind of looking at who he was as he was about ready to get up and hearing what he had to say, I'm like, this guy knows some stuff, and I would love an opportunity to talk to him a little bit more. So being a podcast host pays off again, where I'm able to contact people and say, hey, come talk to us for half an hour. He does have a podcast, as I mentioned. Unspoken Security is the name of his podcast. And his concept with his podcast is very similar to what we've been trying to do here, which is really, there's a lot of stuff in security that goes unspoken or unsocialized. And we really want to create a venue in which we can have those conversations and allow people to overhear them at the very least.
Yeah, I think his audience is definitely very security minded in the similar ways that ours is. I think we're hoping to reach a little bit of a broader audience with hoping to also attract like-minded professionals that maybe are interested in getting more involved in security and compliance. But the background rings true. And I think we're going to have an interesting conversation about what it's like to be managing a security podcast. And then also what are the things that we're not talking about, or I think maybe what's taboo in this space. So I'm looking forward to bringing on AJ.
Yeah, well, let's do it right now. And we're back with AJ. AJ, how are you? Give yourself a quick little introduction so people can hear your voice.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. I'm well, to answer your first question of how am I. Yeah, so I'm AJ Nash. Let's see. Long history. I'll try to cut it down quickly. I'm the founder and CEO of Unspoken Security, LLC, and the host of the Unspoken Security podcast. As far as the LLC, security consulting and intelligence consulting, we'll leave it at that. But my background, originally out of the government space, did about 19 years in the government, half as a defense contractor. Before that, I was in the military. Traditional intel guy, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, countering trafficking in persons, traced war criminals for a couple of years, then countered threats in cyberspace for, 5 years or so. I've been in the private sector about 9 years. Primarily, I build intel programs. I help people build and mature their intel programs, and that led to a lot of public speaking and writing and this thought leadership thing people talk about, going around the world, talking about intelligence and security, intelligence-driven security and security programs. And that's what I do these days. So that's me.
Yeah, that's great. Appreciate that. And super excited to have you on. So one of the things that really brought us to want to bring you on and talk to you is your work with the Unspoken Security podcast, and where kind of we're trying to cover a lot of the same space, I think, where you want to talk about those conversations that generally happen at the bar after a big day at a conference or after a sales meeting. Those types of conversations, I've had many of those types of conversations as well, and those are great. While we're at the same time hey, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't get socialized. We don't communicate these types of things super well. And so I guess let's start with just kind of how your experience has been running the podcast. It's been about a year now for you, I believe.
That's right.
How has that been? Have you been able to accomplish the goals? What's kind of changed as you've gone along?
Yeah, so this was, it's the first time I've done anything like this, really. And so to be clear, originally this was an idea about a year before it launched, maybe even more. A couple friends of mine and I had talked about this. And then my company at the time I was working for, they thought maybe we want to do a podcast. So we had this discussion, and they had a plan that I actually didn't want to be a part of, frankly, originally. And I said, if you want to do that, that's you. I'm not going to. And they said, what do you have? So I presented what I thought the market needed, and they liked the idea. I don't know anything about this stuff, though, if I'm going to be honest. Like, I've never done it before, and I was told how hard it was going to be and all these different, challenges. And I was like, well, we'll just figure it out. So, what I found out in the course of a year is it is hard. So, yeah, people aren't lying. It's just hard in different ways than I was told. Everybody said the hard part would be getting guests. Knock on wood, that has not been a huge issue. Now, it could be because I'm really old, so I have a big network of people that I can guilt into visiting me. So if nothing else, I have friends that'll keep showing up, and they're good. They're better than I am. There's some challenges in logistics and scheduling and getting people lined up for sure. I find bigger challenges. I mean, for certainly topics, making sure you have unique and interesting topics. A lot of people talk about the same things, do the same things. I think that's been a bit of we've done well, I think, but it's not perfect and it's going to get harder as we go. I think the biggest challenge really that I found is developing an audience. Again, I don't really know what the hell I'm doing. That's not a good start. I'm not in marketing. I didn't really have a marketing engine behind me. It wasn't something that my former employer was putting a lot of resources behind. And when I left the company, I took the podcast with me and I have no resources. So that's been a bit of a challenge. Word of mouth's good. I think, but I will say, I think the thing that we started with was the right idea. I said, I don't think people want these canned conversations. They're all scheduled out and scripted. They don't want pitches. They don't want you talking about your products and your services and that. I think people just want authenticity. I've talked about a big concern I have in the world, this misdis and malinformation and this push to a post-truth world. And I think what we're going to have then is a greater value in authenticity. And so I think that's proven to be true. The feedback is that people like, it's a conversation, right? It's not scripted. We have very little framework to start with. The people I bring on are much better than I am. It's, so it feels authentic and real because it is. It's very lightly edited, almost none. I probably should do more when I'm lazy. There's no advertising, at least so far, although if I can get some sponsors, I'd be thrilled because I could use some money. But people like that. So I think there's room in the market for these kinds of conversations. I think that's turned out to be true. Whether I'm going to be able to afford to keep doing it, frankly, is a whole different story. But I've learned that it is hard. It's just hard in different ways. And that some people probably make it harder on themselves. I've also learned that I probably should be better with money, frankly. I'm spending too much to put this together, and I may have to make some changes there. So, but I've enjoyed it. I think that's the other big piece is it's a lot of fun. You get to have great conversations with amazing people from around the world. I've had people reach out to me to be on the show that I didn't know that were awesome. And so, it's a fun thing to do. I hope to continue to do it for a long time and continue to be able to provide things that people care about.
Yeah, I love what you said about authenticity and there being so much of a demand and space for that, because I agree with you. I think there definitely are more security IT podcasts out there. We're definitely not saying that ours are the only ones, but I think the goals are very different, right? I agree with you about what you're saying where, it's not necessarily a sales pitch and that isn't the goal. I know your website specifically says that you're like, that's definitely not what Unspoken Security is about. So, and we can definitely relate to that as well. I think for us with Socializing Security, our goal is very much to being like, hey, like if you say the word security, a lot of people just immediately feel like there's a barrier to entry to that. And this impacts every single one of us every day. And we're making hundreds, if not thousands of decisions related to our personal security on a daily basis that we don't even necessarily realize, whether that's like your garage code being the same code you've had for 4 years or your, your iPhone code being really,
1, 2, 3,
really
4,
easy
5.
to guess and somebody to watch and it's only 4 codes, or maybe you don't even have one, right? So there are things that we want to talk about on our podcast, which is very much about like, how do we socialize this in a way that people understand that it's not like, I have no clue what you're talking about, right? So I think when we're talking about some of these topics, specifically in the security space, like with Unspoken Security, I know you'd said like topics vary and it can go anywhere from mental health to hot topics from like a CISO hot off the press, right? So like what are kind of some of the things that you feel like your team is working on at the moment or that you've noticed more traction on maybe?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is great. Like I said, I think there's really a market there. One thing I've got to work on, I have been told some feedback is sometimes there's too much jargon in my podcasts. People who aren't in security, who want to follow it because they're friends and family, if nothing else, have a hard time sometimes. So there's work to be done in that space. So I think what you're talking about is right on mark. Yeah, when we designed this and started putting this together, I said, listen, I don't want to limit us to just security or just intelligence. I want a wider aperture. And there's a danger in that. I was warned, like if you have a really tight message to people on what you talk about, you will draw an audience. People know what you talk about. If they care about what you talk about, they'll show up. If you have a muddled message with a lot of things you might talk about, it can be tougher to get the audience. but there's a wider aperture for things that you can talk about. So in the case of Unspoken Security, we certainly talk about security, we talk about intelligence, but we also talk about culture as it relates to the work. Like, I'm not talking about general culture necessarily, but if we talk about equity and inclusion and building diverse teams, we talk about neurodiversity, we've talked about stress and grief. Now we talk about leadership. I have a master's in organizational leadership from Gonzaga, go Zags. So I like to bring that in when I can, because servant leadership is the foundation of that. Because they still all fit together. These things matter. We don't work in a vacuum. If you do security all day, you do intel all day, it's not like that means none of the other stuff happens. You still have a boss someplace, so leadership matters, or you lead other people. You still have personal life. You still have time constraints. You still have stress. You still have all these things, right? So it still relates. I'm not, much as I'd like to, we don't have a podcast show about, football or something. That's a little out of bounds. But being in a position to say, hey, we want to be a little more inclusive on what matters, so it's a more holistic look at what it is to be in security, what it is to be in cyber. Some episodes, sure, are very much about a specific topic tied to cyber, the deep and dark web, or data brokers, or incident response, or building intel teams. But some have not been. I got an episode out there that the title of the episode was Spite as Career Fuel, which is a fantastic episode, by the way. Gab Hempel is the guest on that one. And she's great, and she has some great stories to tell. So, there's a lot of opportunities to open it up. And again, it allows people to be themselves. I've said going in, I was told there was a couple ways to do it. You can either have an idea of what you want to talk about and then go find a guest that fits, which can be hard, or you can just find guests and figure out the ideas, which I've chosen. And I find it works better, at least for me, because I just find great people and I say, okay, great. What are you passionate about? What do you want to talk about? And occasionally they say something, I'm like, I just did something on that a couple weeks ago. Do you have another thing you're passionate about? And most people are. And then you're able to work from there. And so going in that they want to talk about what they're talking about, which really helps, right? It's not something I scripted for them and said, hey, I need you to stay in this little bucket. So they talk about what matters to them. I get to learn a lot of times as I'm going. And then we just kind of, figure it out from there. So, I find that that's worked out really well. But again, I have a challenge sometimes in helping people understand what all are we going to talk about? And, is this a show you really want to tune into? And I'm sure I have some people that tune in some weeks and not others. That's kind of the nature of it, I'm sure. But the hope is that it gives a lot back to people, in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I think you have a similar approach that we do, which is we oftentimes we've got a huge list of ideas, but we also at the same time look for people that are interesting to talk to, that have interesting interests, and generally start with, what do you want to talk about? Like, what's your passion right now? And, oftentimes we will have people be like, oh, well, what do you want me to talk about? So, I don't know.
Yeah.
What's getting you excited these days? Like, let's talk about the thing that you look forward to doing during the day, not necessarily what we, want to continue a conversation from the last episode or something like that. So it does become a little bit all over the place. Honestly, some of my favorite podcasts are those that, hey, we're gonna talk about the media, but talking about the media means talking about how the media covers culture and how they cover computers and technology and how they cover politics and how they cover the weather, and it leads to a lot of really interesting topics that I might not normally think about. It's kind of that all things considered type of an approach to things. So obviously there are a lot of topics, and security has no lack of topics. And that's one of the areas where we said, yeah, we've got more than enough runway if we want to do a podcast on security. We throw in compliance into that as kind of, more Milu's specialty, and being able to put those two out there means we've got no lack of topics to touch on. And we've gone into mental health, we've gone into education. I think we've got more ideas, both people and just straight up topics on those areas. So with so many topics and with so many good people that like to talk about it, why do you think that it is something that is so unspoken, that people find this to be a taboo topic in a lot of ways?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some things are talked about all the time, right? And listen, we're a for-profit business. Our industry is for-profit. So there's no problems getting people to talk about things that make money. People will talk about their products and services ad nauseum. People will talk about threats and risks, all the scary stuff they can put in the news. That's not a problem. People will talk about all these things, but there's a lot of things I think that don't get talked about because there's a wall there sometimes. Hey, everybody's got their pitch. Tell me about your product, tell me about your service. Everybody can tell you that, and they've got their pitch and they've got their stats and why it's dangerous and whatever, and how we're going to solve the problem. But very few of them can go, here's the bad things. And the reality is we're not very good at solving this. Nobody is. We might be the best of the bunch of bad products, but you need something. Nobody's going to say that. Some problems are harder to solve than others. And people don't want to say that part. Part of sales and marketing is to follow up, give people a problem, and then follow up with how do we solve it for you? Not follow up with, well, and you're screwed. Good luck. So, sometimes you have to have people on. They're going to have those more honest conversations. Some of them aren't allowed to. It's not good for business, or maybe it's, they're not good for the company. People don't want to talk about, the other things outside of business that you mentioned, like mental health and diversity. Listen, mental health's been a taboo topic forever. I think it's getting better over time. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to appear vulnerable or weak in some way, which is not what that is when you speak about mental health. Diversity has become highly politicized, but then again, so is education, a lot of other things. So, there's a danger there. Listen, we're also a very fractured society right now. Anything can offend somebody. Most things are going to offend 30% or more of the society. And so people don't talk about much of those things, or they can avoid it. If you stick to the pitch, you stick to whatever marketing gave you and whatever legal approved for your company, you're fine. You're probably not in trouble. And if you end up drawing ire, at least the company goes, well, that's our words. So I think people have some fear about stepping out and being authentic. I think that's backlash from social media and the internet and the politics that we have going on, hostilities, things that used to be discussions. Not nobody, but a lot of people seem to have a very hard time with disagreement now as just an option, civil disagreements, hey, we have a disagreement. We have a difference of opinion. There's a lot less of that. There's a lot more of the, you have a difference of opinion. Well, get the hell out of my country. Jesus, that escalated pretty quickly. We just don't agree on something. I had a discussion. I had a thread going on Twitter. I don't know how it got there, but it was a discussion about whether Puerto Rico should be a state. And it started very friendly. And 7 or 8 lines later, it was very clear that the other person inside this conversation wasn't intending to be friendly and was just looking for something to create a problem. And, then called me a bunch of things and got blocked because that's how it works. So, I think having a place where people can have honest, open, direct conversations to talk about topics that are harder and harder to talk about and feel safe that they're going to be able to do that matters. I think people want to hear some of these things. They just don't want to say them anymore. And that's a tough spot to be in. So, and we'll see where it goes going forward. Listen, we're not getting better as a society in some of these areas. I think it's getting harder and harder and may get much harder in the coming years. So we'll see who's continuing to step out there and what the consequences might be.
Yeah, again, I think we're coming back to authenticity. I think that matters a lot. And I also like what you just said about creating safe spaces for open, transparent dialogue and discourse. I think for us, when we're talking about information security topics, our goal is really to be learning alongside our guests, right? So that not only Brian and I are experts in certain things, but not everything. And in the same way that I'm sure, AJ, you could talk about some very, very specialized topics. That doesn't mean, right, that you're an expert in everything. And so there's something about we're learning with our guests and bringing them on and being hey, we're actually learning with our guests as we're interviewing them and taking things away. That's kind of one of the things I've taken away the most from doing a podcast, of being hey, this is something I'm taking value with beyond, right, what we're talking about, the amount of time that we're putting into this and stuff of is the venture worthwhile? We're having fun doing it. So for us, that's fine. But yes, they cost money, and we're not blind to that fact. So I think when we're thinking about information security, there are definitely spaces for conversations. I think what's interesting, right, is when we're thinking about certain things that aren't talked about. For example, I brought up an example earlier that just came, but I was actually, how many of us have the same garage code that we've been using for years? Sure. You know what I mean? That all of our family members or neighbors know that, ideally, right, we should be changing every couple of months. I'm not trying to put myself on blast, but I think it might be time for me to change mine.
That's why I have defense in depth. I've got that same code, but I've also got cameras in my garage and an alarm system and different code on the door. It's a few layers if you're going to get in the house. So yeah, defense in depth. So I can have that easy access to the garage for some people, but it gets harder.
I'll one up that and say I've got an air gap because my garage is not attached to my house.
Another key point, you asked about why things aren't talked about. I think some of it is because people don't want to look stupid. I'm just going to use the word, right? It's not the greatest word, but things are complicated and difficult. We're an industry full of jargon and terminology, and it's constantly changing. And so I think a lot of people are afraid of looking like they don't know something, which is fine. Listen, like you said, there's a lot more that I don't know than that I do know. And I have lots of conversations with people where I'm geez, I'm going to have to do a lot of research just to understand the conversation we're about to have. But I think a lot of people struggle to show that side and say, hey, I don't know. I don't know is a tough thing for a lot of people to say. And so I think that's another reason some of these conversations get harder or they become taboo or people don't want to have them, is it's easy to nod along and say, yeah, and not dig in. And then, you're fine.
Yeah, we've had similar conversations before about thinking about why is it that we're so bad about our personal security when we've gotten actually quite good at corporate security. And one of the conversations we've had on previous episodes is being like, yeah, it's because it feels like work. It's because we've done a lot of information security trainings. We're aware of like that we need to be better at password management for corporate systems. And then we're lazy about it in our personal lives because we're just like kind of tired. And so, which is scary, right? Because actually, like, we've had this conversation where I've been like, I actually care significantly more about my colleagues' personal finances being secure than I necessarily do about a spreadsheet being like ironclad. Like, and so there's something about that, right? That security feels like work for a lot of people, which is why we don't update our garage codes when we're supposed to, or, change our iPhone codes to something that's not easy to guess.
And that's not limited to us, by the way. Like, there are, I grew up a million years ago. I grew up in sales. My father, my whole family, and salespeople are notoriously easy to sell to. They just are. There are plenty of doctors who don't take very good care of their own health. It's not just us. But yeah, I do think it's a big chunk of us because, again, it does feel like work, and we do it all the time. Work never stops in this industry. So you're always working. And yeah, I don't have perfect security practices. I do all right. I have some that aren't great. I had something happen, earlier this year, and I was like, okay, well, I'm finally going to do the thing I should have been doing 8 months ago because now I got to make sure this isn't an issue so it doesn't spread. And I fixed it, right? But it took something happening for me to go, all right, I got to take this more seriously. All the advice I give other people, it's just, you get lazy about it and also you see it all the time, and it's easy to get defeated in our industry. Everything's compromised. Listen, everybody I know, everybody everybody in the world probably is compromised at some point. So you just start going, it's just, all right, so somebody stole my credit card data again. Somebody has my personal information again. Okay. I mean, this has just become a thing now, and you just manage it and deal with it. So, I try to be prioritizing things. I do prioritize physical security quite a bit because, that's a more imminent threat should it happen.
I mean, I'm guilty of it too. Just to show everybody that you're not alone if you are challenged with it. I've got a home lab. It's really, really small. I've got a home router. It's somewhat old because it continues to work, and I'm not one to throw something away if it's working. But that also means that updates aren't coming as fast as maybe they used to be. And not that I'm fast at applying those updates in the first place. I've got a home NAS that needs an update, and I was looking at it the other night, like, okay, when is everything not happening so that I can do it without disrupting everything? And I've got to shut down all these other things that are dependent on it. And, oh man, this is going to be a 3-hour ordeal. And that means I'm going to be up till 2:00 in the morning working on this thing because that's the only time I could do it. And life gets in the way. And, it is challenging. Whereas with work, we could say, this is part of my job to go do this thing. And the time is built into that. Like, I could push off these other things I need to do because this one thing is, we've all agreed to as being very important there. And, maybe we've got somebody looking over our shoulder. Maybe we've got, some built-in process that forces us to do it, whereas we don't necessarily have that at home.
Well, and that's another key thing is motivation, right? So, like in my case, I'm ADD. So I'm diagnosed as an adult. In retrospect, clearly always was. But, things I've learned as a result of that, one of the things I've learned about people who are ADD is generally we're motivated by two things. We either have to want to do something or we have to do something. There's not much in between. Either you want to do it, so you'll do it, and sometimes you'll prioritize things you want to do ahead of things that really should be done and are higher priorities because you go down this rabbit hole and it's interesting and then you're in it, or you've just run out of time and it has to get done. It's a priority. And when you talk about security, a lot of times that happens. I have a mesh network in the house that's a pain in the ass, and I'm constantly working and tinkering with it. I have way too many smart devices in this house. And so it's, I should probably do a better job with it and figure it out. I don't know. I think it's okay for now. My security probably needs work. If somebody wants to come drive by and see what you can do, go for it, I suppose. But, I have encryption and I'm fine. People talk about like the cameras. Do you worry about it? I don't really. Like, I don't worry too much about it. I don't worry about being robbed or things like that. Because again, I still have an alarm system. I also still have dogs and guns. Like there's and you want to come visit the house, like take your chances, I guess. But I mean, that's the thing, right? Is you have to need to do it, right? The incident I talked about earlier this year, I had an account that was compromised, happens all the time everywhere, right? Well, it was an account that I, like most people, had a bunch of creds that were reused. That same username and password was on a ton of accounts. And I was like, shit. All right, well, this is a big enough deal. I better do something now, because it happened to be tied to some financial accounts. I was like, these are my priorities. So I finally did the thing I should have done years ago, and I randomized, 50 some odd passwords, which is a big pain in the ass. But I had to now, because now I had an imminent threat. Somebody had access to credit card information and could commit all sorts of fraud and could get into all my other financial accounts. So I was forced to make it a priority. And suddenly it got done in, that day. So I think that's another concern. And a lot of people in our industry are neurodiverse. So I think that's another thing, is a lot of folks, unless you have to do it or you want to do it, aren't going to do it. There's a lot of shit I get done every week that wasn't a priority and probably shouldn't have been a priority, but I got it done. It wasn't on my list. I make giant lists of things to do, and the end of the week, I'm like, damn, I didn't do any of those things, but I did these 7 things that were really good. And it just sort of
Making my language.
balances. Yeah, it's so common, right? So I mean, that's another issue, I think, with the security for us folks, is a lot of us just don't want to, because again, as Manu said, we're buried in it all the time. It's work. It all feels like work, so I don't want to do any more of it. So instead, I'm going to, do 6 hours of PlayStation and finish this game I've been wanting to finish for 8 years. Even though that doesn't have to happen, that's going to happen today, because that's going to make me feel good. And so that's what gets done, right?
Yeah. Well, sometimes you need to do those things just to get them out of your head, because they won't ever leave your conscious thoughts, and they keep getting in the way of doing other things.
Yeah, drag everything else down.
Yeah, and that is an ADHD coping mechanism that I've learned to some extent as well. So we've talked about the need to be more authentic, to be more willing to put yourself out there, to break through that fear of being seen as not knowing everything that you want everyone to think you know. And I put it that way in a very specific manner, because nobody expects you to know everything. And if they do, then they've been putting you into the wrong position for everybody. I think there's also a level of ignorance that people have, that, you talked about the need to get over having to use industry specific terms and explain like I'm 5 type of conversations is hard for some of us that are so buried in these acronyms and terminology. So a lot of this all comes down to, we just don't all have the same knowledge base, and that makes it hard to communicate.
Absolutely.
Just like it is when we don't all have the same language. So there's a level of, and I put all this in front of using the word ignorance, but because I'm using ignorance in its true textbook definition, which is we don't know everything. And we get into a conversation where we are going to have a gap there. What do you find through the conversations you're having that help to cut through that ignorance, to help to, not only yourself and your guests, but, all the people that may be listening today and tomorrow, help them to be able to come along with this conversation and not get lost?
Yeah. So I think the first key is, in the true sense of the word, as you said, ignorance, which is just not knowing. Ignorance isn't bad. All right. We need to stop. People need to stop convincing other people to feel bad about this. Like, yeah, I'm ignorant about a whole lot more things than the other way around. And I've been around the world a while at this point. It's okay to not know things. It's fine. And it's not a weakness to say so. It's actually a strength to say, hey, I don't know. Let me learn. Learning is a good thing. We should keep wanting to do that. So I think being honest about that and saying, hey, everybody isn't going to know everything. I think within the podcast, I've gotten better, hopefully, in some of the minor structuring I put together. I just did a prep call earlier today for a podcast I'm going to record later this week. And I said, here's kind of the format I'm at this point. I kind of want to start with, all right, let's lay the foundation. Quick definition of whatever the topic is. What is this? What do we mean when we say this? Because not everybody knows. I didn't realize, a friend of mine told me, I've been doing this a while, and he said, there was an episode he couldn't follow. He didn't know what CISO meant. Now, in our industry, if you don't know what CISO means, I don't know what you've been doing, but he's not in our industry. And I was like, all right, I hadn't thought about, spelling out Chief Information Security Officer, but I guess, we should do that, because I also want this, and I think you probably do too. We want to include people who aren't just in the industry. Security needs to be something that is not taboo, that more people know about, that people are comfortable talking about, maybe even excited talking about. And that starts by, letting them in the door. If you open up with a bunch of different jargon and 3 and 4 letter terms, et cetera, you just lose people and they just tune out. Or if you open up with a ton of tech stuff. I don't have, so far on the show, I don't have anybody from sales. I've never had a sales title on the show, because just not needed. And no offense. I mean, sales is needed in life, but I think it'd be a hard draw. Even if they're a great customer or a great guest, it's a hard draw when their title is, some sales position. People don't want to tune in. And I haven't had super massively technical conversations, even though I've had incredibly brilliant technical minds. I like to find people who can turn it into regular talk. Because if it goes down this rabbit hole of technical layers, et cetera, people glaze over, myself included.
And even with an
like,
hour episode, you can't get super technical anyway.
Exactly. No, you really can't. So, I mean, I think it's important to be able to say, hey, listen, nobody knows everything. We're here to talk about things that hopefully we can help other people learn a bit about. We'll leave gaps. There's not enough time to tell you everything, but you can find more information if you want and talk to the guest or me or do some research, whatever you'd like. And so I think people just have to be okay with that. And we have to help people be okay with the idea that it's good to show up and not know things. That's important. We should all want to keep learning and knowing things. And in our industry, we don't, right? Imposter syndrome is huge in our industry. It's probably huge in a lot of industries because, I've read, at least the good news is if you have imposter syndrome, it's because you're probably pretty decent at what you do. You're good enough to know all the things you don't know. And then you think everybody knows those things. If you're a narcissist or just absolutely dim-witted and don't know anything, the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, then you probably don't have any issues with imposter syndrome because you actually think you're pretty bright, even though you may not know much. And that's something to keep in mind, is that most of us know a fair amount and also know that we don't know anything. And we just have to help people get that that's okay. I don't care how brilliant the guest is. They have things to learn. I have tons of stuff to learn. I'm still surprised people listen to anything I have to say, frankly. So I think that's a big piece to this, is helping people get that and say, hey, ignorance is good. If I say, hey, if somebody thinks you're ignorant on a topic, it shouldn't necessarily be an insult. And then to overcome it, it really comes down to people who actually want to, though. I mean, that's a totally different side of the coin. There are people who want to live in their ignorance. Now, that generally gets into like misdis and malinformation. That gets into some of the political spectrum and gets into some of the culty things that, that are going on and conspiracy theories. If people want to,
we're talking about a whole other podcast, not just an episode.
Yeah. But it is important, I think, for us to commit to wanting to know an ugly truth instead of believing a pretty lie. And if people can't do that, then they're going to stay ignorant. There's nothing you can do about that at some point. You have to just accept some people want that. But for those who want to continue to learn and grow and, have the humility to say, I don't know what I don't know and I want to learn it, I think there's great opportunities to have conversations to expand upon those things.
Yeah. Well, AJ, we do like to always kind of like summarize and wrap up with our guests where we ask the same question to like pull it back a little bit and add some cohesivity between episodes because our topics vary. And so one of the things, we have that in common as well. And one of the things that I had a CTO recently say that he felt like the fight for privacy was dead and that now it's really the fight for security. Obviously, given your background in security and intelligence, I think you might have an interesting perspective on this. So where do you feel like we're at for the fight for privacy? Is it still alive and well, or have we really pivoted now and it's the fight for security because we can no longer believe that our information is private?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd be really interested to know who the CTO was. So I actually wrote an article on this, I wrote a magazine article on this, I don't know, a couple of years ago now at this point. And the title was something to the effect of privacy is dead. So I think that probably gives you an idea of where I'm going to go with my answer on this. I'm inclined to believe the CTO is probably correct. Now, that does not mean that all of us should go, I'm not going to worry about my privacy. I think it's a bad idea, but I think we're close to being in that position. I've talked about a post-truth world. I've also talked about a post-privacy world. And I think it's a combination of factors. First of all, so many things have been compromised, but there's also a matter of, it's a generational shift. The Gen Z, millennials, they live a more public life by choice. They live on social media. They're, things that, listen, I'm a Gen Xer, things that we wouldn't have done, things that our parents definitely wouldn't have done in public or talked about. It's just everyday occurrence now. There's a generation of people who don't really care about their privacy. Now, they may care later. I think there'll be some regrets down the road, but it doesn't matter by then. It's going to be over. So I think there'll always be some level of privacy. I just think it's gotten to be a much smaller and smaller a bit of data, right? I think people still have skeletons in their closet, but I think the challenges there are because there's less and less of it, even though it's really important. I think people also are less and less focused on security. And ultimately, we may be in a position where there is nothing that's private. And the world's going to be a very open space. And some will say that's great. We'll all be authentic and everybody will know everything. And those people who say that, I would ask them, do you want everybody to know everything about you? And you don't answer the question, they won't. But the answer is always no. Somebody has something. It might be minor and nothing, by the way, but we're all embarrassed about something in life. So Yeah, I think privacy is more of a concept than a reality at this point. I think most of it's gone. I don't think that means we stop fighting for it. I think it's still a big part of security. I don't think we give up. I do think a lot of things that aren't private, they also just fade away. There's new privacy, right? So if tomorrow you said, I'm going to be a very private person, everything in the world that's out there is out there, but you can stop giving things away. And over time, your life does change. And then you have more privacy as you go. You just have to accept that you've given a lot away. So, there's a chance to come back to it, but privacy is not a priority, frankly, for the upcoming couple of generations. Being out there and, some chase of fame or whatever is a much bigger deal. There's a lot of chasing of the jackpot of fame that you have to give up privacy for. So yeah, I mean, the CTO that you talked about, I happen to side with on this, but again, I don't think that means we stop trying. And I think for those who want to be private, you still have an opportunity. You just have to make different choices and recognize that a choice is everything now. Listen, 30, 40 years ago, you had a secret get out. A dozen people knew about it in your neighborhood. Now a secret gets out, 10 million people around the world, most of whom don't even know you, know it. They may not care, but they know it now. And it's just out there and it's forever. So, I think we have to be careful with it, but I just think generationally, it's probably a dying concept at this point.
Yeah, very big generational differences there. That there's a rabbit hole I could go down, but we don't have time for that, unfortunately. AJ, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you being willing to jump on with us. I would encourage everybody to go look up Unspoken Security and listen to some of your episodes. I think you'll find them very familiar if you've been listening to ours. Very similar types of conversations, similar structure as well. So anything else that you would like to leave people with, final thoughts or ways to contact you, AJ?
As you said, Unspoken Security. So you can find me and find us, unspokensecurity.com. You can email me at aj@unspokensecurity if you want. We're on all the podcast, platforms you're familiar with. We're on YouTube, et cetera. So yeah, I'd love for people to check it out. If you know somebody who'd be a good guest or you want to be a guest, feel free to ping me and I'll see what I can do to make something happen there. Or if you hate the show, let me know. Please don't tell the public. If you love the show, tell everybody. And we also do, some consulting services and security services and things like that, if that can help folks. But, the only two things I would leave people with is one, for anybody who's watched this instead of just listening, I've had this bottle in my hand the whole time. This is cream soda. Anybody who knows me knows I don't drink, but it does look like a beer. I've realized as I've been drinking it, but it is cream soda and it's delicious. It's a vice of mine. And, and the other thing is I think, it's just important for all of us to keep having these conversations. We really are all in this together, like it or not. There's a lot of teammates you may not want to have, but security is still a team game and we're all in it together. And the more the safer you're going to be, the more people we know, the more communication we have, the more community we build, the better off we're all going to be. So I hope these conversations, like the ones we have on my show, like the ones we have on your show, and I really appreciate you having me. I hope they continue, and grow. I think there's so much opportunity for us to do so many great things in the future, but it starts with conversations like these.
Yeah. Awesome. AJ, thanks so much for socializing security with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Great conversation with AJ, right, Milo?
Yeah, agreed. Definitely nice to have another like-minded podcaster out there who's doing similar work on unspoken security. So I think that's really encouraging. And I definitely hear some of his woes of, what it is to get something up and running, right? We're very grateful for those of you that are tuning in on a regular basis, and then we, continue to hope to grow our audience. And it sounds like he's struggling with something similar. So, that was reassuring because it's definitely something that we've talked about, of making sure that we get our voices out and that we're not just doing this for the two of us to listen to.
Not that that wouldn't be enough, but, it is encouraging to have people actually want to listen to it and comment on it and things like that. So we truly do appreciate everybody that reaches out to say something or share on LinkedIn or post a comment to things. It is a flooded environment, though. So we also get that there's a lot of other podcasts to listen to. I struggle with having, 15 different podcasts I want to listen to and time to listen to about 3 on a regular basis. So we get that. And that makes me just appreciate those of you that do listen in. Hopefully what we can bring is that authenticity. And one thing I'll try to be mindful of more in the future is, trying to explain like I'm 5, more of the topics we talk about, not assuming everybody knows everything as we get into these topics, because that does make it more inclusive. It does make it open to more people to listen to and be able to understand it and not get lost in the first 10 seconds and therefore be lost the entire episode.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's common across any work environment, that acronyms are really off-putting, especially, you'll hear those stories of like a new hire that's like, I need a glossary and I need, the cheat sheet with all the acronyms. And security and IT and compliance is not an exception to that rule by any means. Those are definitely there. I do think generally we try to do a pretty good job about explaining what an acronym is, but that doesn't mean, right? I like what AJ had said about being like, no, actually, there's some value of just being like, what is this thing that we're about to talk about? And like really trying to explain what the topic is before you dive in with the guest. I like that idea as well, what he's trying to achieve.
I think that was a good conversation. I think I learned quite a bit in that conversation, things that we can do better. And I would definitely encourage people to check out his podcast. I've listened to a pretty heavy handful of episodes at this point and have really enjoyed those conversations. Definitely different types of people than I've talked to on a regular basis. So, different people have different circles that they can bring people in on. And I know, Milo, you and I get excited whenever we find somebody that's way outside of our normal orbit and we're like, oh, let's try and get this person on. And most people are pretty excited to come on and join us, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I'm grateful for the intro and I really enjoyed the conversation. So yeah, thanks to AJ for joining us.
Yep, totally. And thank you all for listening again, and we'll talk to you again next week. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.